stepping back in time in relation to the history of the People's National Congress over 64 years. You have said that ideology played a significant part in this first phase of the People's National Congress. And at what point was there a change? Has there been any change? And at what point?
Well, one can well argue that the People's National Congress has gone through a number of phases in terms of its own growth and development. One may wish in some regards to look at the first phase as 1957 to 1964. And that phase was essentially centered around the People's National Congress attempting to gain ascendancy as the main party and as the governing party in Guyana. So we see between 57, 61 and 64 the electoral struggle being conducted by the People's National Congress to attain ascendancy as the main party in Guyana. And that's a very, very important period. And what we saw during that period was the dysfunctionality of our electoral system. Because during that period, particularly in 1957 and in 1961, when we had a first-past-the-post system, we saw the People's Progressive Party repeatedly getting seats disproportionate to the number of votes. Let me explain that. Because of the constituency system, the People's Progressive Party was able to attain approximately 40% of the votes. Clearly not a majority of the Guyanese votes. But against the background of 40% of the votes, they used to get 60% of the seats. 60% of the seats. And so it didn't reflect a real democratic situation, particularly in a plural society where the voting had emerged by then largely along ethnic lines. Remember I said earlier on that the ethnic issue is one that one has to take into consideration, because even at the formation of the PPP, that issue is recognized. Hence the attempt was made at that time to bring together Burnham and Jagan. So you have a party reflecting the plurality of the Guyanese society. So 57, 61, the PPP gained ascendancy at the parliamentary level based on a flawed system that allowed them to get 40% of the votes, but at the same time 60% of the seats. On that basis, the People's National Congress campaigned for a new system, a system of proportional representation, so that the government structure, the governance should be reflective of the will of the people. And so that was what occurred during the period 57 to 64. During that period, there were two other things. One other thing that happened, there was also the ongoing struggle for independence and the relationship between independence and the will of the people. And so the system being called for, the electoral system being called for, was one to manifest the will of the people, so the will of the people could be an integral part of the independence process and independence negotiations. And so there were independence conferences which were held. Based on those independent conferences, eventually we got the British to agree that we have proportional representation, and that again is something we should clarify. There was a difference between the People's National Congress and the PPP in this question of proportional representation. They went to the conference in London, and that difference was maintained. When they recognized that they could not come to a conclusion, it was Chelly Jagan, and this should be written into our annals. It was Chelly Jagan who said that they would let the British make the determination, since we could not collectively do so. So he ceded the authority for the decision making to the British, and the British came back with PR. They came back with PR, and so PR was introduced. But having ceded that, when they came back with PR, Chedi came home and launched a campaign against PR, but he was the one who gave the British the authority. But they launched a campaign, and in launching that campaign, tried to argue that in fact the British and the Americans had manipulated Ghana into a PR situation to get the PPP out of government. Now, two things I want to re-emphasize. One, that first past the post was disproportionate, and so the PPP were getting more seats than they would have gotten in relation to the number of votes. So that was one issue. Two, that Chedi himself conceded that the British should make the decision, so the British made the decision. And what is of particular interest is that the elections held in 1964 with PR, where there was a lot of obvious ethnic confrontation and ethnic clashes, saw the PPP getting more votes, so that they seemed to be the beneficiary at that time of the ethnic divide. So they got more votes in 64 than they'd gotten in 61, and they'd gotten in 57. But that more votes did not add up to a majority of the Guyanese population. And so at the elections in 1964, the governor called upon the UF and the PNC, which parties collectively had gotten the majority, to form the government. And so again, one needs to emphasize the point that the PPP in 64 did not have a majority. They may have had the plurality among the parties, that meaning of the parties that contested, singularly they had the most votes. But the government was formed by two parties that had the majority of votes, so that was reflecting the will of the Guyanese people. So the period 1957 to 1964, one could see that as the period of electoral struggle on behalf of the People's National Congress to gain electoral ascendancy, which in some regards one may now contend that they gained in coalition with the UF, and was able to attain the seat of government in 1964, and to use that to move Guyana on to independence. What should be noted in that regard is that the Independence Conference was not attended by Chedi. It was largely the People's National Congress, and the UF attended that conference, and therefore are the parties that really brought independence to Guyana. And so in that regard, that raises another question about the role of the PNC, and more specifically the role of Burnham, because very often people like to refer to Chedi as the father of the nation. But Chedi did not take us to independence. No, undoubtedly he was involved in the independence struggle because it predated 1964, but he did not take us to independence. It was Lyndon Forbes Sampson Burnham that attended a conference in London that finalized independence and became the first Prime Minister of Guyana, and therefore for all intents and purposes, as minimum, he has to be seen as one of the founders of this nation we now call Guyana. So that's about the period, the 1957 to 1964.